Chapter 2 of Roads of Destiny. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Foster. Roads of Destiny by O. Henry. Chapter 2. The Guardian of the Accolade. Not the least important of the force of the Weymouth Bank was Uncle Bushrod. 60 years had Uncle Bushrod given of faithful service to the house of Weymouth as chattel, servitor, and friend. Of the color of the mahogany bank furniture was Uncle Bushrod, thus dark was he externally. White as the uninked pages of the bank ledgers was his soul. Eminently pleasing to Uncle Bushrod would the comparison have been, for to him the only institution in existence worth considering was the Weymouth Bank, of which he was something between porter and generalissimo in charge. Weymouth lay, dreamy and umbrageous, among the low foothills along the brow of a southern valley. 3 banks there were in Weymouthville. 2 were hopeless, misguided enterprises lacking the presence and prestige of a Weymouth to give them glory. The third was the bank, managed by the Weymouths, and Uncle Bushrod. In the old Weymouth homestead, the red brick, white porticoed mansion, the first to your right as you crossed Elder Creek, coming into town, lived Mr. Robert Weymouth, the president of the bank, his widowed daughter, Mrs. Vesey, called Miss Letty by everyone, and her 2 children, Nan and Guy. There, also in a cottage on the grounds, resided Uncle Bushrod and Aunt Melindy, his wife. Mr. William Weymouth, the cashier of the bank, lived in a modern, fine house on the principal avenue. Mr. Robert was a large, stout man, 62 years of age, with a smooth, plump face, long, iron-gray hair, and fiery blue eyes. He was high-tempered, kind, and generous, with a youthful smile and a formidable, stern voice that did not always mean what it sounded like. Mr. William was a milder man, correct in deportment and absorbed in business. The Weymouths formed the family of Weymouthville and were looked up to, as was their right of heritage. Uncle Bushrod was the bank's trusted porter, messenger, vassal, and guardian. He carried a key to the vault, just as Mr. Robert and Mr. William did. Sometimes there was $10,000, $15,000, or $20,000 in sacked silver stacked on the vault floor. It was safe with Uncle Bushrod. He was a Weymouth in heart, honesty, and pride. Of late, Uncle Bushrod had not been without worry. It was on account of Marcy Robert. For nearly a year, Mr. Robert had been known to indulge in too much drink. Not enough, understand, to become tipsy, but the habit was getting a hold upon him, and everyone was beginning to notice it. Half a dozen times a day he would leave the bank and step around to the Merchants and Planters Hotel to take a drink. Mr. Robert's usual keen judgment and business capacity became a little impaired. Mr. William, a Weymouth but not so rich in experience, tried to dam the inevitable backflow of the tide, but with incomplete success. The deposits in the Weymouth Bank dropped from 6 figures to 5. Past due paper began to accumulate, owing to injudicious loans. No one cared to address Mr. Robert on the subject of temperance. Many of his friends said that the cause of it had been the death of his wife some 2 years before. Others hesitated on account of Mr. Robert's quick temper, which was extremely apt to resent personal interference of such a nature. Miss Letty and the children noticed the change and grieved about it. Uncle Bushrod also worried, but he was one of those who would not have dared to remonstrate, although he and Marcy Robert had been raised almost as companions. But there was a heavier shock coming to Uncle Bushrod than that caused by the bank president's toddies and juleps. Mr. Robert had a passion for fishing, which he usually indulged whenever the season and business permitted. One day, when reports had been coming in relating to the bass and perch, he announced his intention of making a 2 or 3 days visit to the lakes. He was going down, he said, to Reedy Lake with Judge Archinard, an old friend. Now, Uncle Bushrod was treasurer of the Sons and Daughters of the Burning Bush. Every association he belonged to made him treasurer without hesitation. He stood AA1 in colored circles. He was understood among them to be Mr. Bushrod Weymouth of the Weymouth Bank. The night following the day on which Mr. Robert mentioned his intended fishing trip, the old man woke up and rose from his bed at 12 o'clock, declaring he must go down to the bank and fetch the passbook of the Sons and Daughters, which he had forgotten to bring home. The bookkeeper had balanced it for him that day, put the canceled checks in it, and snapped 2 elastic bands around it. He put but 1 band around other passbooks. Aunt Melindy objected to the mission at so late an hour, denouncing it as foolish and unnecessary, but Uncle Bushrod was not to be deflected from duty. "I done told Sister Adeline Hoskins," he said, "to come by here for dat book tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, for to carry it to the meeting of the Board of Arrangements, and that book going to be here when she come." So Uncle Bushrod put on his old brown suit, got his thick hickory stick, and meandered through the almost deserted streets of Weymouthville. He entered the bank, unlocking the side door, and found the passbook where he had left it, in the little back room used for consultations, where he always hung his coat. Looking about casually, he saw that everything was as he had left it, and was about to start for home when he was brought to a standstill by the sudden rattle of a key in the front door. Someone came quickly in, closed the door softly, and entered the counting room through the door in the iron railing. That division of the bank's space was connected with the back room by a narrow passageway, now in deep darkness. Uncle Bushrod, firmly gripping his hickory stick, tiptoed gently up this passage until he could see the midnight intruder into the sacred precincts of the Weymouth Bank. One dim gas jet burned there, but even in its nebulous light, he perceived at once that the prowler was the bank's president. Wondering, fearful, undecided what to do, the old colored man stood motionless in the gloomy strip of hallway and waited developments. The vault, with its big iron door, was opposite him. Inside that was the safe, holding the papers of value, the gold and currency of the bank. On the floor of the vault was perhaps $18,000 in silver. The president took his key from his pocket, opened the vault, and went inside, nearly closing the door behind him. Uncle Bushrod saw through the narrow aperture the flicker of a candle. In a minute or two, it seemed an hour to the watcher, Mr. Robert came out, bringing with him a large hand satchel, handling it in a careful but hurried manner, as if fearful that he might be observed. With one hand he closed and locked the vault door. With a reluctant theory forming itself beneath his wool, Uncle Bushrod waited and watched, shaking in his concealing shadow. Mr. Robert set the satchel softly upon a desk and turned his coat collar up about his neck and ears. He was dressed in a rough suit of gray, as if for traveling. He glanced with frowning intentness at the big office clock above a burning gas jet, and then looked lingeringly about the bank. Lingeringly and fondly, Uncle Bushrod thought, as one who bids farewell to dear and familiar scenes. Now he caught up his burden again and moved promptly and softly out of the bank by the way he had come, locking the front door behind him. For a minute or longer, Uncle Bushrod was as stone in his tracks. Had that midnight rifler of safes and vaults been any other on earth than the man he was, the old retainer would have rushed upon him and struck to save the Weymouth property. But now the watcher's soul was tortured by the poignant dread of something worse than mere robbery. He was seized by an accusing terror that said the Weymouth name and the Weymouth honor were about to be lost. Marcy Robert robbing the bank. What else could it mean? The hour of the night, the stealthy visit to the vault, the satchel brought forth full and with expedition and silence, the prowler's rough dress, his solicitous reading of the clock, and noiseless departure. What else could it mean? And then to the turmoil of Uncle Bushrod's thoughts came the corroborating recollection of preceding events. Mr. Robert's increasing intemperance and consequent many moods of royal high spirits and stern tempers. The casual talk he had heard in the bank of the decrease in business and difficulty in collecting loans. What else could it all mean but that Mr. Robert Weymouth was an absconder, was about to fly with the bank's remaining funds, leaving Mr. William, Miss Letty, little Nan, Guy, and Uncle Bushrod to bear the disgrace? During 1 minute, Uncle Bushrod considered these things, and then he awoke to sudden determination and action. "Lord, Lord," he moaned aloud as he hobbled hastily toward the side door. "Such a come-off after all these here years of big doin's and fine doin's. Scandalous sights upon the earth when the Weymouth family done turn out robbers and bezzlers. Time for Uncle Bushrod to clean out somebody's chicken coop and even matters up. Oh, Lord, Marcy Robert, you ain't gonna do that. And Miss Letty and them children so proud and talking Weymouth, Weymouth all the time. I'm going to stop you if I can. Expect you shoot Mr. Negger's head off if he fool with you, but I'm going to stop you if I can." Uncle Bushrod, aided by his hickory stick, impeded by his rheumatism, hurried down the street toward the railroad station where the two lines touching Weymouthville met. As he had expected and feared, he saw there Mr. Robert standing in the shadow of the building, waiting for the train. He held the satchel in his hand. When Uncle Bushrod came within 20 yards of the bank president, standing like a huge gray ghost by the station wall, sudden perturbation seized him. The rashness and audacity of the thing he had come to do struck him fully. He would have been happy could he have turned and fled from the possibilities of the famous Weymouth wrath. But again he saw in his fancy the white reproachful face of Miss Letty and the distressed looks of Nan and Guy should he fail in his duty and they question him as to his stewardship. Braced by the thought, he approached in a straight line, clearing his throat and pounding with his stick so that he might be early recognized. Thus he might avoid the likely danger of too suddenly surprising the sometimes hasty Mr. Robert. "Is that you, Bushrod?" called the clamant, clear voice of the gray ghost. "Yes, sir, Master Robert." "What the devil are you doing out at this time of night?" For the first time in his life, Uncle Bushrod told Marcy Robert a falsehood. He could not repress it. He would have to circumlocute a little. His nerve was not equal to a direct attack. "I done been down, sir, to see old Aunt Maria Patterson. She taken sick in the night, and I carried her a body of Melindy's medicine. Yes, sir." "Humph," said Robert. "You'd better get home out of the night air. It's damp. You'll hardly be worth killing tomorrow on account of your rheumatism. Think it'll be a clear day, Bushrod?" "Hello, it will, sir. The sun saw it red last night." Mr. Robert lit a cigar in the shadow, and the smoke looked like his gray ghost expanding and escaping into the night air. Somehow, Uncle Bushrod could barely force his reluctant tongue to the dreadful subject. He stood, awkward, shambling, with his feet upon the gravel and fumbling with his stick. But then afar off, 3 miles away at the Jimtown switch, he heard the faint whistle of the coming train, the one that was to transport the Weymouth name into the regions of dishonor and shame. All fear left him. He took off his hat and faced the chief of the clan he served, the great, royal, kind, lofty, terrible Weymouth. He bearded him there at the brink of the awful thing that was about to happen. "Marcy Robert," he began, his voice quivering a little with the stress of his feelings, "you remember the day they all rode the tournament at Oak Lawn? The day, sir, that you win in the riding and you crown Miss Lucy the queen?" "Tournament?" said Mr. Robert, taking his cigar from his mouth. "Yes, I remember very well But what the deuce are you talking about tournaments here at midnight for? Go along home, Bushrod. I believe you're sleepwalking." "Miss Lucy touch you on the shoulder," continued the old man, never heeding, "with a sword, and say, 'I mek you a knight, Sir Robert. Rise up, pure and fearless and without reproach.' That what Miss Lucy say. That's been a long time ago, but me nor you ain't forgot it. And then there's another time we ain't forgot, the time when Miss Lucy lay on her last bed. She sent for Uncle Bushrod, and she say, 'Uncle Bushrod, when I die, I want you to take good care of Mr. Robert.' It seemed like, so Miss Lucy say, he listened to you more than to anybody else. He apt to be mighty fractious sometimes, and maybe he cuss you when you try to swade him, but he needs somebody what understand him to be round with him. He am like a little child sometimes. So Miss Lucy say, with her eyes shining in her po thin face, but he always been, them was her words, my knight pure and fearless, and without reproach." Mr. Robert began to mask, as was his habit, a tendency to soft-heartedness with a spurious anger. You old windbag," he growled through a crowd of swirling cigar smoke. "I believe you're crazy. I told you to go home, Bushrod. Miss Lucy said that, did she? Well, we haven't kept the scutcheon very clear. 2 years ago last week, wasn't it, Bushrod, when she died? Confound it, are you going to stand there all night gabbing like a coffee-colored gander?" The train whistled again. Now it was at the water tank a mile away. "Marcy Robert," said Uncle Bushrod, laying his hand on the satchel that the banker held, "for God's sake, don't take this with you. I knows what's in it. I knows where you got it in the bank. Don't carry it with you. There's big trouble in that valise for Miss Lucy and Miss Lucy's child's chillun. It's bound to destroy the name of Weymouth and bow down them that own it with shame and tribulation. Marcy Robert, you can kill this old nigger if you will, but don't take away this her valise. If I ever crosses over to Jordan, what I going to say to Miss Lucy when she asks me, 'Uncle Bushrod, what for you didn't take good care, Mr. Robert?'" Mr. Robert Weymouth threw away his cigar and shook free one arm with that peculiar gesture that always preceded his outbursts of irascibility. Uncle Bushrod bowed his head to the expected storm, but he did not flinch. If the house of Weymouth was to fall, he would fall with it. The banker spoke, and Uncle Bushrod blinked with surprise. The storm was there, but it was suppressed to the quietness of a summer breeze. "Bushrod," said Mr. Robert in a lower voice than he usually employed, "you have overstepped all bounds. You have presumed upon the leniency with which you have been treated to meddle unpardonably. So you know what is in this satchel. Your long and faithful service is some excuse, but go home, Bushrod. Not another word." But Bushrod grasped the satchel with a firmer hand. The headlight of the train was now lightening the shadows about the station. The roar was increasing, and folks were stirring about at the trackside. "Marcy, Robert, give me dis here valise. I got a right, sir, to talk to you dis here way. I slaved for you and tended to you from a child up. I went through the war as your body servant till we whipped the Yankees and sent 'em back to the North. I was at your wedding, and I wasn't fur away when your Miss Letty was born. And Miss Letty's chillun, they watches today for Uncle Bushrod when he come home every evening. I've been a Weymouth, all cept in color and entitlements. Both of us is old, Marcy Robert. 'Tain't going to be long till we goin' to see Miss Lucy and has to give an account of our doin's. The old nigger man won't be expected to say much more than he done all he could by the family that owned him. But the Weymouths, they must say they been living pure and fearless and without reproach. Give me this valise, Marcy Robert. I'm going to have it. I'm going to take it back to the bank and lock it up in the vault. I'm going to do Miss Lucy's bidding. Turn her loose, Marcy Robert." The train was standing at the station. Some men were pushing trucks along the side. 2 or 3 sleepy passengers got off and wandered away into the night. The conductor stepped to the gravel, swung his lantern, and called, "Hello, Frank," at someone invisible. The bell clanged, the brakes hissed, the conductor drawled, "All aboard?" Mr. Robert released his hold on the satchel. Uncle Bushrod hugged it to his breast with both arms as a lover clasps his first beloved. "Take it back with you, Bushrod," said Mr. Robert, thrusting his hands into his pockets, "and let the subject drop. Now mind. You've said quite enough. I'm going to take the train. Tell Mr. William I will be back on Saturday. Good night." The banker climbed the steps of the moving train and disappeared in a coach. Uncle Bushrod stood motionless, still embracing the precious satchel. His eyes were closed and his lips were moving in thanks to the Master above for the salvation of the Weymouth honor. He knew Mr. Robert would return when he said he would. The Weymouths never lied. Nor now, thank the Lord, could it be said that they embezzled the money in banks. Then, awake to the necessity for further guardianship of Weymouth trust funds, the old man started for the bank with the redeemed satchel. 3 hours from Weymouthville in the gray dawn, Mr. Robert alighted from the train at a lonely flag station. Dimly he could see the figure of a man waiting on the platform and the shape of a spring wagon, team and driver. 6 lengthy bamboo fishing poles projected from the wagon's rear. "You're here, Bob," said Judge Archinard, Mr. Robert's old friend and schoolmate. "It's going to be a royal day for fishing. I thought you said... Why, didn't you bring along the stuff?" The president of the Weymouth Bank took off his hat and rumpled his gray locks. "Well, Ben, to tell you the truth, there's an infernally presumptuous old nigger belonging in my family that broke up the arrangement. He came down to the depot and vetoed the whole proceeding. He means all right, and, well, I reckon he is right. Somehow he found out what I had along, though I hid it in the bank vault and sneaked it out at midnight. I reckon he has noticed that I've been indulging a little more than a gentleman should, and he laid for me with some reaching arguments. I'm going to quit drinking," Mr. Robert concluded. "I've come to the conclusion that a man can't keep it up and be quite what he'd like to be. Pure and fearless and without reproach. That's the way old Bushrod quoted it." "Well, I'll have to admit," said the judge thoughtfully as they climbed into the wagon, "that the old darkey's argument can't conscientiously be overruled." "Still," said Mr. Robert with a ghost of a sigh, "there was 2 quarts of the finest old silk velvet bourbon in that satchel you ever wet your lips with." End of Chapter 2.